Hello, thank you for joining us for this podcast mini-series in which I will be discussing with my excellent colleague Kelsey Morrell trauma-informed legal representation and all things related to it. Kelsey is an associate here at C.M. Murray. She has particular experience in cases involving discrimination, harassment and sexual assault. And as a result, Kelsey is well placed to discuss the topic of informed legal representation related to trauma cases. Good morning, Kelsey. How are you?
Good morning. Thanks for doing this talk with me.
I think probably my first question is, can you explain what trauma-informed legal representation is?
Trauma-informed legal representation is really simply about understanding trauma's effect on the brain and how that might impact on a client's or other people involved in a case, even if it's not your client, how that might impact upon people's behavior. And also about thinking of ways that you might, as a lawyer, as a legal representative, adjust or tweak your representation, your practices in ways that can make people feel a lot more comfortable and that can get really much better results for your client or a witness or whoever it is who might be experiencing the effects of trauma.
Now, at what stage would you start to apply these tools or techniques? When you've got a new client, when does it start?
I think it's important to recognize that everyone has mental health, and even people who haven't experienced an acute traumatic event, some of these tools and tips are really actually just good client care that you can apply to everyone. And then you don't have to necessarily always think, here's my clients who have experienced trauma and here are all my other clients. Even if the case doesn't involve a traumatic event, if that's not sort of central to, if you're not doing a sexual violence case, for example, it could be that a client or a witness has experienced trauma in their personal life or in their professional life in a way that doesn't impact upon your case, but still affects their behavior or affects the kind of environment that will make them feel most comfortable and be able to build a good relationship of trust with you. So some of these things I'd say you should always consider implementing.
I think that's really useful. We deal with clients who at the top of their field and will generally have something that's really important to them, that's impacting them, on which they're taking advice. And it's always really important to remember how important that is to the client in the first instance, and then approach this not as a one-size-fits-all anyway type of advice, but to truly understand what the client is trying to achieve and how important it is for them. I'm guessing that these sort of tools and tips that you're going to talk us through in a minute will be relevant in those circumstances.
I think it's also important to recognize that trauma-informed legal practice isn't just for people who are working with vulnerable communities. So, if you're working in a rape crisis center, of course, that's something that you're going to be constantly applying. But actually, even in our work with senior executives, people who, even if they haven't experienced harassment or sexual assault or discrimination, they, may have circumstances which are affecting them. And I think it's important to remember that high functioning, really successful people also have mental health and also have things which may be, which if you address them in small ways could really allow for a greater relationship of trust and allow them to, provide more information to you and to trust your judgment and build that relationship, which we are, as you say, helping people navigate really difficult situations in their lives. And so that relationship of trust is really fundamental to the work that we do.
Yeah. Having discussed already now why it matters to bear this in mind, do you want to give us some practical tips?
This is a non-exhaustive list, but some of the things that I've done, for example, would be giving people agency. So anytime someone has experienced, a lot of the clients that I've worked with in the past who have experienced, for example, some severe sexual violence or harassment, one of the things that they often feel has been taken from them is agency. So one thing you can think about, it doesn't have to be all the tips, like the specific examples that I give you, is how can I give agency to my clients. So that might be simple things like, do you prefer a phone call or a video or an in-person meeting? Are there certain times of day that are easier for you to talk about, especially if it's a difficult topic? You know, I definitely have had clients before where they will never want to have a morning meeting, especially if we're going to be talking about sensitive topics, if they then have to go to work or they have to go take care of their children for the rest of the day. So they might prefer something towards the end of the day. Equally, I've had clients who will be very anxious about that meeting all day long, and so they would prefer to get it done at the beginning of the day and then put it behind them. You know, I might suggest to them, if I know it's going to be a particularly difficult call, I'll usually give an agenda. I won't spring things on people particularly if it's going to be a difficult conversation. And I will tell them things like, please take your time if you need to pause, if we need to reschedule. And I think part of that also comes to how you plan your cases. So, you know, obviously emergencies happen, things crop up last minute, but wherever possible, you should try not to leave things to the last minute, because someone may not be in a state to get through the material you wanted to get through that day. They may need to reschedule. They may, you know, it's not uncommon for people who have recently experienced something traumatic to go to ground, and it may be that they don't respond to you for a while. And so I think that that's also an important thing to be thinking about, is to not make assumptions about people's behavior. If they're not responding to you, it may not be because they don't care about their case, or because they don't like working with you, or maybe they found a different lawyer, or, you know, there's sort of assumptions that people can jump to, when it may just be that, you know, a common thing that people will do if they're struggling would be to avoid. And that's not an exhaustive list, so there's plenty of other examples, and there's lots of great trainings that you can attend or resources online that can give you other examples that lawyers will do. If you are speaking to someone, if you're having a meeting with a client where you need to gather very sensitive information, another thing I will do is signpost, okay, we need to talk about the details of this assault, for example. And to the best of your ability, try and get all of those questions done at once. What you don't want to do is sort of keep going back and bringing them back to that space. Because if you're looking at a long course of discrimination or harassment, for example, there's a lot of information that you need to gather, which probably isn't going to be upsetting to somebody. And so the last thing you want to do is be peppering them with upsetting questions throughout the entirety of your call. But equally, you need to be flexible that, you know, if you say, do you want to take a break from this for a while and we can talk about this topic instead, and we can come back to it.
From my experience, having advised individuals who have either been subjected to a serious sexual assault in the workplace by a work colleague, often alcohol can be involved, and that can cause the individual to feel an element, well, that they just don't quite understand how it happened, and it can be really difficult for them to warm to us in order to disclose, because they may not have spoken to anybody about it before other than perhaps a trusted friend. And I found that whether it's a sexual assault or a traumatic event that is causing somebody's mental health to suffer a serious insult, that it's really important for us to ensure when we're talking to them that they, if we're not doing it in person, that they are in a safe place themselves, and that after the call that they will have something that will support them, whether that's the next step, such as, you know, in our view, I think you need to go and speak to a doctor or seek some advice, or otherwise, if we know that that person is already under a doctor, that they are able to go and access that advice straight away. But it can be really difficult.
I mean, one thing that I will often do is, and this does require a certain amount of experience in the field that you're dealing with, is I'll normalize things. So when someone starts to disclose something maybe they're ashamed of, or they're embarrassed by, um, or they think might negatively impact their case, which of course you need to know as their representative. You can't give adequate merits advice if there's information or facts which are potentially damaging to their case, which they've withheld from you. And so one of the things that I'll often do is say, that's really common. If they, there's certain things that we do tend to see a lot. And sometimes people will internalize those things and be reticent to share them. And when they start to share things, just saying, and it's not legal advice, but you can just say, oh, that's something, we see really often. That's not unusual. And I think that often will open the door to them sharing a lot more. And I think the other thing that I will sometimes do is say, explain why I'm asking a question, particularly if it's a question that could be interpreted as victim blaming. If you're having to get to explain, well, why didn't you send this message then? Can you explain that? Often people won't report for a long time. That's very common. And you do need to try to explain that. Even if and it doesn't have to be a good explanation. There's no right answer to, why did you report when you reported, and why didn't you report at different times. There's not a right or wrong answer to that, but that is information that the client is likely to be asked and that you need to understand. And so I will often give some background understanding to why that matters to my information gathering, and that it's not because I'm in any way trying to suggest that they should have done something differently. And bearing in mind that a lot of people who have, by the time they've come to a lawyer, they might have disclosed to an employer or a university, for example, and they may have had those same questions asked in a very different way, and so may have a particular sensitivity to them. And so I'm trying to be mindful of the kinds of questions I'm asking. I still have to ask them because they're important, but you can ask them in a way that builds trust rather than breaks it down.
Kelsey, we mentioned at the start of this that it's a mini series. Can you give us a flavour of what the next 2 episodes might involve?
We'd like to speak to an expert about the effects of trauma on the brain. It can be really helpful, I think, to understand what might be affecting people's behavior and thinking processes. We'd also like to speak to an expert who works in investigations. So understanding how trauma might affect people's memory, for example, what's the best way to gather evidence? If you're conducting an investigation, whether you're doing that internally, as part of an HR team, or maybe you're doing that as if you've been hired as an independent investigator, how can you get the best evidence and, bring the best case on behalf of your client while also bearing in mind the science that may be impacting that evidence.
Fantastic. Really important topics to be covered. I'm looking forward to those. Thank you very much, Kelsey.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this podcast, and there are, as I said, 2 further episodes at least to follow in this mini series. Please listen out for the next episode. And for more podcasts and many more resources, please check out our website, www.cm-murray.com.